Good evening, Europe. First of all, thank you for your time and your interest in our webinar, Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. Please note that this webinar is going to be recorded and published on our social media. And if you don't want to be seen or heard, please switch off your camera and microphone. Also, please have your microphone muted. If you don't speak, you can raise your hand or ask question in the chat, and we will come back to you with answers. I would also like to welcome Geoff Corre as our speaker and Piotr Azia as our host tonight. Piotr has organized this webinar in the name of European Liberals for Reform, and we are very happy to have you in the team, Piotr. Thank you very much. Before we get started, I would like to take the chance to introduce myself and European Liberals for Reforms to you real quick. I am Teresa Zettel and one of the co-founders of European Liberals for Reform. And we also have Ben Burgess here, who is another co-founder of European Liberals for Reform. So most likely you haven't heard about European Liberals for Reform before, which is also because we are relatively young. We got together in May and decided to become a think tank based on liberal values with the vision of a united Europe. And that was in October. So we are not a European party, and we do not compete with European parties such as ALDE or Volt. And I really want to emphasize this. But what we do is we share our experience and knowledge with each other in our working groups. And at the moment, we have 14 different working groups on different themes and topics where we discuss ideas and visions, how to improve European politics. Yeah, and as I just mentioned, working groups, our working group Migration and Refugees is passionately working on a European citizen initiative. And they meet every second Friday online, and Vladan Lausevic, who is also here, is the chairperson of this working group. Yeah, you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and sign up for our newsletter to be up to date with our activities. The next big thing will be the Orange Days, where we will raise awareness for fighting violence against women. That was it from my part, and I hand over to Piotr now. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening to all again. Bonsoir tout le monde. First of all, a bit of general things. Please turn off your microphone, mute it when you're not speaking, which will be everybody except Geoff in a minute. Just to introduce Geoff, presumably if you are here, it's because you've read the introduction I prepared for Geoff. He's a member of the advisory board for Locate International. He used to work with Ofsted and Her Majesty's Constabulary, etc. You've read it. You're here because Geoff sounds like a very interesting person. Geoff, to prove it now. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I must endorse what Piotr said. It's very nice to see people from all over Europe. I'm going to talk about human trafficking and modern slavery. And this is a difficult, complex issue. It's also a major human rights issue across the globe. It's not just Europe. It's not just Asia. It's across the globe. And it's also the fastest growing criminal activity across the globe. So it's a major, major issue. So I'm going to start by looking at the big picture, try and get some idea of estimate of the frequency, how big the problem is, the rate of it, an estimate of the scale and the prevalence of this problem. And I'll follow that with a short video. And after the video, I just would like to pause after the just to get your reactions to that video and just have a little chat. And then I'll carry on because Now, the terminology in this subject can be very confusing. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time after that clarifying what we mean, who we're talking about, and why. So after the what, I'll be talking about the who. So who are the perpetrators, who are the victims? And then I'll give you some real life. We use the term case studies, but of course they're not case studies, they're people. And they're two cases which I was professionally involved in. So I can speak from the heart and from professional to explain two very different cases, but this will illustrate it in terms of real people. And then I'll end on a slightly more optimistic note, I hope, by telling you what's being done to tackle the problem. And after that, I'll be very happy to answer any questions. Now, modern slavery, it's best to see this as an umbrella term, which includes trafficking and exploitation, across, including forced labour, which is what we'd normally call as slavery. And victims can be anybody. They can be men, women, children from across the world. Now, it's often described as a hidden crime in plain sight. In other words, it could be happening in your neighbourhood, in your street, in your city, anywhere. And I hope to raise awareness to help you to identify it in the future. And looking at the European figures, there between 2017 and 18, there were more than 14,000 registered victims, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg, registered victims. In the United Kingdom, there were over 5,000 offences recorded, but again, they're the only ones that recorded, and I think that's a very different issue when they're recorded. Okay, so modern slavery, remember, is this umbrella term, and there are two elements to it. One is human trafficking, which I shall go on to explain, and the other is what we understand by slavery, that is forced labour and exploitation of people. And it's a very sad reflection that in the modern world, some people, human beings, are still treated as commodities by certain people. And, you know, we may think slavery officially ended a couple of 100 years ago, but sadly it hasn't. So to give you some idea of the scale and prevalence, again, these figures, they change almost as soon as you put them on the screen. As I said, it's a major human rights concern and a criminal issue of great concern. The fastest growing criminal activity. Now, the International Labour Organization has estimated that something like 2.5 million people are trafficked globally. But again, we don't really know that it's a hidden crime. And it is sadly, it's huge business for organized crime groups. Again, I've got this figure of $32 billion a year. It's probably gone up since I put pen to paper. In the first quarter of 2019, this was just in the United Kingdom, the National Crime Agency, which is an agency of all police forces across the country to deal with serious and organized crime, estimated about 24,000 within the year. But again, these figures don't mean an awful lot. One figure that I think you'll be probably surprised and shocked to hear is that 42% of them were children. That is, people under the age of 18. So it's quite a shocking statistic. Now, I'm going to show you this film. Please feel free to unmute yourselves. How did you feel watching that?
When I see this, this is well, not what you can call having respect for human rights, etc. It's not the first time that I see this. That's true. It happens also in Belgium. I saw. Well, I can prove people to show you people, women, specifically women, who came to Brussels, by example, and in the neighbor on the train stations. Behind the train stations, there is a road called Aarschot Street, and all those women are come together there, and that's for prostitution. They use it for prostitution. So, in fact, it's not correct. They have no legal papers. They have nothing. They just have to stay in there, and that's it. It is very disrespectful. That's true.
Thank you. Pavel, you wanted to speak?
Yes, thank you. Well, what really strikes me is the fact that the movie emphasized that it happens right next to us, but it's invisible. Because I think we often allow ourselves to be in the trap that, no, I live in a good neighborhood. No, my friends wouldn't do that. And we kind of try to fool ourselves that it's definitely not here. While, as you emphasize, it is. We just don't see the signs. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I don't know your full name. You've got
René. René was.
Yeah, my reflection is just as long as we are in a sort of capitalistic system where, you know, sales and buying is part of the world, then, you know, some people are looking for a better life and then they're ending up in being exploited.
Thank you. I will come on to talk about some of the methods by which people are exploited. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Any further comments? All right, thanks. Well, obviously there'll be a further opportunity for discussion and questions at the end. So I'll continue. Okay. So I'm going to just give you briefly some definitions because it does get very confusing. And there, actually, interestingly, there is a debate within the sector about the terminology because it does get very confusing. We tend to use the term modern slavery as an umbrella term, as I said, and that includes human trafficking and forced servitude and slave labor. But let me give you the current definitions. So firstly, human trafficking. Now, this is an internationally agreed definition, agreed by the United Nations, and it was adopted by the Council of Europe in 2000. And it's, as a result, it's called at a meeting at Palermo. So it's called the Palermo Protocol. So that the definition is as follows. Human trafficking has to have three elements: the act, that is what is done, the means, how it's done, the purpose, why it's done. And I would just explain what these three elements mean. But to be human trafficking, it must have the three. So the act is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, or receipt of persons. So the interesting thing there is the receipt as well. It's not just the people who do the transportation and recruitment. And this is a whole process of recruitment, transportation, etc. Now, one thing to bear in mind, which I think is important, is trafficking can take place within a country's own borders. So whereas smuggling takes place from one country to another, trafficking can take place across borders, but it can take place within borders. For example, within the United Kingdom, we've had a whole spate of trafficking for child sexual exploitation. This is where groups of men recruit vulnerable young girls, often in care of local authorities, that is, when they cannot be looked after by their own parents, and exploit them for sexual purposes. So and then transfer them from one city to another or from one area to another. So that's trafficking, but within the country. Similarly, you may or may not be familiar with the term county lines. This means where criminals will exploit and recruit young people to act as runners for drugs and sometimes weapons as well. So that's trafficking within borders. And how do they do it? Well, by means of threat, force, I won't read them all out, coercion, essentially, etc. It's abuse of power, coercion. Now, the Palermo Protocol refers to these methods to receive the consent of a person. I don't like that term because consent should be in inverted commas. They don't give their consent, they are coerced. But this is the term that's used. Methods are used to get the so-called consent. And then finally, the purpose for why it's done. Well, it's for the purpose of exploitation. And that includes all these things: sexual exploitation, forced labour, etc., etc. Now, in the case of children, a child can never give consent, even presumed consent. Only two elements required: the act and the purpose. But sadly, despite that, as I said, a large number of children are still exploited. Now, just briefly, the distinction, I think, again, I've heard politicians mixing the two, and I think many people do. So let me just explain the difference. So somebody who is smuggled usually approaches a people smuggler, pays them a lot of money to be smuggled from one country to another with a view to seeking asylum and then subsequently refugee status in another country. And usually the relationship ends at the border. So they pay them and off they go. Now, they may subsequently become trafficked later on. But essentially, smuggling means crossing a border illegally and seeking entry into a different country. Now, as I said earlier, trafficking doesn't necessarily mean crossing a border. It can do, but it can take place within borders. So essentially, smuggling is a crime against the state and trafficking is a crime against the person. So those are the distinctions. Let me explain a little bit about the trafficking process, because sadly, it's a business model. It's a very sophisticated process, and this will happen both internally and externally. I'll refer to cases in Vietnam, which is what I know most about. And what will happen is that a local broker who will be recruited by somebody from an organized crime group will go into a vulnerable area, a village where struck with poverty, where they cannot make a living properly for one reason or another. and will recruit people and will say, come to Europe, we can get you a good job. It's going to cost you a lot of money, but it'll be worth it. And what I've seen is people will mortgage their homes or sell their land to send one member of the family, usually a young man, to go over to Europe in the expectation that they can earn a lot of money legally working and send it back to the family. And sometimes families have made themselves very poor. And then they're recruited, they're deceived into thinking that they can get themselves a job. And then they use the process known as debt bondage. What this means is they say, okay, it's cost you 2,000 euros to come across, but actually it really cost 3,000. Therefore, you must work for me for another year without pay to pay off the extra debt bondage. And if you don't, we know where your family live and we will threaten your family back home. And this is what happens. The other forms that are used are oaths and coercive control. Oaths, particularly people from West Africa, there are particular kind of religious and systems of belief, which means that if you make an oath to somebody, you are then bound to that person and you have to do what they say. Now, as a result of all this, the traffickers will have coercive control. Now, this term is usually used in respect of domestic violence, but it's a very similar sort of process. The trafficker controls the person. They will often take away their passport, make them dependent on them, threaten them, psychological control and physical control. So they will use coercive control. The person becomes effectively captured by the trafficker. And that leaves them vulnerable and open to the exploitation which then follows. It's a pretty nasty business. And the purposes are several. Sexual exploitation, often women from Eastern Europe transported to Western Europe for purposes of sexual exploitation. Young men from Vietnam for cannabis cultivation, which is a big business, something like £35 billion profit, and 4 million people, which sounds a huge number of people. But they have this particular market, the criminals from Vietnam. Sometimes people come over from particularly Romania for child begging and theft. You may see people on the streets with a young baby, sadly very often drugged up to the eyeballs, so they're very compliant begging. Don't give money to them, report them to the police and give money to a charity. I would urge you to do that if you see them. Also for domestic servitude, people will come to a house made to work very long hours, very hard for very little reward. Benefit fraud, they will take away their benefits and get them to claim money from the state. Thank goodness there hasn't been too many cases of organ harvesting, but there have been some of adults and children. And then mainly for labour, in particular areas such as construction, car washes and nail bars. These are particular areas of concern. So the purposes are depending on the age and the gender of the person. Let me come on to ask, who are the victims? Well, as I said, they're people who are vulnerable for various reasons. And we talk about push and pull factors. So what are the push factors? Poverty, mainly. People from, if you like, the south part of the globe, very often seeking a better life, who cannot make a living in their own country for various reasons. One of which is climate change. And I'll come on to climate change because it's a major issue now in many, many countries. And it drives migration and trafficking. And there are economic and environmental reasons why. If you look at areas where there have been floods, droughts and fires, people have lost their access to rural life, to agriculture. They've lost crops, so they cannot earn a living through traditional methods of growing food. And so they've lost their means of support. Again, coming back to Vietnam, I can give you a particular example of the seas around one particular area which were polluted by a chemical, so people couldn't fish. Their fishing stocks went. The same around one area of Ghana. And the poorest people are more vulnerable to climate change and environmental degradation because they need natural resources more than other people. Their livings, their income depends on it. So climate change is a big push factor as well. But so again, of course, is conflict. In many areas of the world, as we know, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya, long-term conflicts are still going on, and that's another huge reason why people migrate. So that's the push factors. So what are the pull factors? Well, as I said, recruitment. They will go to an area, recruit people, get them on board, and then almost sometimes literally the trapdoor will close and they will keep them under their control. They will use coercive control. They will deceive them into thinking they're going to get a job. And again, this term grooming is used often in terms of sexual abuse and exploitation. But in fact, it applies here as well, because sometimes they will give them a present, same as young people who are sexually abused. They will give them a present, pretend to befriend them, sometimes give them alcohol and drugs, and that's part of the grooming process. And then when they've captured them, the mood changes very, very dramatically, and these poor people then become exploited. So there's a whole, as I say, it's a well-trod business model for criminal crime groups. So who are the traffickers? Well, as I said, they're organized crime groups. Often they will employ local brokers to recruit people, and they will operate in cells. It's very difficult to break through them or to disrupt them, because it's a bit like terrorist groups. They will operate in cells, often not knowing each other. And again, if I take the case of Vietnam, the old North Vietnam had lots of links with Eastern Europe through universities, people going to university sponsored by the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. And there are existing Vietnamese communities in many countries, some of which have been infiltrated by criminal crime groups, and they will then take people, transport them often from Vietnam all the way across China, or fly into Russia and then be transported by road across into Western Europe. And they will be little groups who won't know each other. And it's very difficult to get to what in police terms is called the snake's head, the leader, the Mr. Big. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And sometimes you can't even find the snake's head, let alone cut it off. So what do we mean by slavery and labour exploitation? Well, you can read this for yourself. They're owned, they're forced to work, and grossly dehumanised, as I would explain in a particular case. And as I said, the International Labour Organization estimates that globally something like 24 million people in forced labour, and that's a huge number of people. And it's a pretty horrific sight. I'll give you some case studies. Sometimes if I do a longer one, I'll do all four. I'll give you two of these. This was a case, the Connors case. This took place within central England, a place called Bedfordshire, the east of England. And this was, dare I say it, a family business. You can see this is father and son. They are a traveller family. What they did, they were convicted under the old legislation. We now have a Modern Slavery Act, and they would have been given longer sentences. But what they did, the whole family did, was they recruited vulnerable men. They would go to soup kitchens, social security offices, other places like that. And again, follow this pattern of recruitment. Say to them, look, we can give you a good job, come and join us. They would often ply them with alcohol and drugs, and then they would take their benefits and use them horrifically in slave labour. They were used for construction and paving jobs and some agricultural jobs. Now, what you're seeing here is a surveillance photo. One of the men escaped, reported to police, and there was a police raid. But prior to that, there were surveillance photographs. Now, this is Mr. Connors Senior. You don't have to be an expert in body language to see what's going on here. This man is being bullied and exploited, and you can see the expression on his face. So this was taken before the raid, and these people, when the officers went into the site, this was the conditions in which the people were living, pretty horrendous. And these estimates were enormous. They had something up to 100 victims, £1 million seized, and £2 million in assets. While the victims were suffering badly, the Connors family lived a life of luxury. When they were rescued, the victims were just so exploited. They were malnourished. They wandered around like victims, and they needed an awful lot of support. And the organisation actually in the UK is the Salvation Army, who have done a lot of good work in supporting people with a contract from the Home Office. So that's an example of trafficking within a country for the purposes of labour exploitation. And I think they got 12 years and 7 years imprisonment. They would have got more under the new legislation. The next case, which I'll mention to you briefly, is this little fella here, who would be called Din. In a classic case of a young person, many young men are transported from Vietnam to France and Britain in particular, particularly Britain, for the purposes of cannabis cultivation. This was a case in which I was involved. This young man was dropped off what we call in a lorry drop. In other words, a group of about 20 young men from Vietnam were picked up in Romania, transported right across Europe and from Calais to England. And the driver was innocent in all this, as far as we know. He opened the back of his van. A number of young men ran out into the local fields, were apprehended by the police, and some of them are coached to say that they are under 18, because if they are over 18, they will go to a detention centre for immigrants. If they are under 18, they will come into the care of the local authority and go into a children's home or a foster home. And in many cases, as in the case of this young man, they will run away very quickly back into the hands of traffickers. So within a week or less, he ran away from his foster home, back into the hands of the traffickers, was involved in cannabis cultivation, and tragically in this case, subsequently died of an overdose. And this was a case which I was very much involved in, a tragic case, and I think a lot of professionals have learned from this case. So, on a slightly more optimistic note, what is being done about the problem? Well, as you probably know, in April this year, the EU announced a new strategy on combating trafficking in human beings, and I think a new law is proposed. They also got a number of other things, new regulations and trying to break the business model, and new proposals to protect victims. This is resulted in a new proposal for an EU-wide human rights law. One of the strands of it is to make human rights due diligence mandatory for all EU companies. Excuse me. So this means we don't know the source of all the goods, but we must make every effort to audit them, to check proper due diligence, to make sure that they're not involved in slavery. So there will be a new requirement on all businesses to make sure they undertake audits and due diligence in their supply chains. And I think that's something that's important. Business has a role to play. We all have a role to play. And it also means that there's a sanction. So there will be corporate liability if businesses fail to do that. And I think that's important. And the EU will also provide additional resources to protect victims and support them. So to conclude, what I like to remember, the way to remember this is the 4 Ps. The first is prevention. We need to raise awareness in vulnerable communities, and this is being done often by the NGOs, the voluntary sector. There's a very good organization called Blue Dragon in Vietnam, and they go into these vulnerable villages and tell people, look, don't be fooled, don't be deceived, please don't fall for it. We can help you in other ways. Don't be fooled by this, don't go along with it. So that's one strand. Another is, I really do believe that it's important on Western governments to have safe routes of migration so that people aren't forced to come into the country secretly, clandestinely, and then apply for asylum. It really doesn't make sense. What you need is a system whereby you can get a visa from your home country and go into a Western country claiming asylum, something like the kinder transport, something like that. That's really doesn't exist anymore, which seems very strange indeed, that you have to enter the country illegally and then apply for asylum. we also, in the long term, this is obviously much more long term, need to address the socio and economic and the climate issues, of course. But obviously that's going to take a long time. But I do think that Western governments should also have an obligation to provide aid to countries that need it, not charity, but aid to help with proper economic development. If there were proper economic development, fewer people would need to move. They could earn a living and remain where they want to remain. And as I said, the other thing is proper supply chain due diligence. So that's prevention. The second P is prosecution. This is also important. We need to ensure that there are sufficient deterrent sentences and that individuals and organised crime groups are prosecuted for serious offences. The third is protection. And that involves medical and psychological support for victims, proper interpreting services, the provision of legal advice, financial support, housing, and opportunities for employment. People migrate for employment reasons. I've never met anybody who's migrated to gain social security payments. People want to work, but they need to be given the opportunity to work legally. And the final P is everybody needs to work in partnership. Now, the key agencies in all this are various agencies working internationally. This is the only way this problem is going to be tackled. But essentially, within borders, the agencies that need to work together better are the police, the immigration services, the local authorities, that includes social services, childcare services, and so on, businesses, and finally, all of us, you, the public. Remember the film, look back, look at the signs, spot the indicators, report it, be aware, and tell your communities that this could be going on in your street, in your neighbourhood. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Geoff. Well, this was a very interesting presentation, and I think we're sort of all taken aback. What a huge problem it is, and what heartrending situations you've been describing. I see already Ben has raised his hand and has a question for you. Ben, unmute, please.
Oh, sorry, I was just applauding.
Okay, you're applauding.
Thank you.
I think Vladan has a question.
Thank you.
And I think he's very concerned because he is operating in exactly the same field or similar field.
Yes.
Exactly. That's the cool. Sorry, that's the case, Piotr. And thank you very much for your very touching and informative presentation, Mr. Corre. I can just start by saying that I have some personal experience with like human trafficking because I kind of grew up in Bosnia during and after the war, and I remember these like information posters that were made by the UN and NATO, because there were cases like of, you know, even where I was growing up, like kids being kidnapped and so on, and ending up in Italy somewhere, you know, being used for horrible stuff. And I kind of want to ask you two questions, if it's possible. So the first question is regarding more, let's say, migration, or let's say migration in general. As I understand, in the UK now, during the new government with Johnson and the Home Office Minister Patel, as I understand, they introduced a law basically kind of forbidding, you know, illegal work, but that means that the government is punishing people only because they were forced into the country and then forced to work. And the second question is more about security, because I'm also active in an organization called Democracy Without Borders. The idea there is that there should be, like, sometimes in the future, if we manage to organize a kind of united human planet or a world federation, that there should be some kind of a global police force. Do you think that would be a good idea, to have global police force, global legislation that can conduct human security across the world and also fight against human trafficking and other organized crimes?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll answer your first question first. I'll take them in order. Thank you for your questions. There's a bill which is going through Parliament at the moment called the Nationality and Borders Bill through the Home Office. And I think in my opinion, this is a populist movement because it would appear to take a hard line on migration. But in fact, it's going to make things harder for people to actually enter the country legally. It's hard enough as it is now, but it's actually going to make things actually harder. And it's going to make things difficult for children as well. So I think it's actually going to make things worse than at present. It's not going to offer proper, safe, legal routes. And it's going to punish people, that people can be returned to their country. They have to make, one of the other provisions within it is that people have to make an application for asylum within, I think, 2 weeks of arrival. But professionals in the field know that if people are very traumatized, and also they're very fearful of authority, it's going to take them time before they can make an application. And I think they could be punished effectively for being traumatized. So I do not think that this new bill is going to help. There is some opposition to it within Parliament, and I hope there's going to be enough amendments to stop it going through as it is. But I don't think the thing's going to help at all. Now, in respect to your second point, I don't think it would be possible, it may be desirable to have a world government, and maybe we need to be invaded by aliens from space to have a world government to make us realize that all humanity is the same. But I don't think it'd be possible to have a world police force. I know somebody mentioned Interpol. I think what's important is that international cooperation and exchange of information and people working together. If I've got time, if I can give you an example of a particular case I was not personally involved in, but a colleague of mine was, in which a young woman from Lithuania was exploited into the United Kingdom, and she was sexually exploited within the United Kingdom. A colleague of mine worked very well with the Lithuanian police force, and he was actually commended by the Lithuanian government for working together. So I think cooperation, partnership, working together is probably the best solution.
Thank you very much for your answers.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? I see raised hands, René.
Yeah, my general comment is basically like you pointed out in your presentation. One of the drivers are that people are looking for a better life, and it means that the poverty is the, let's say, the source of why some people are dreaming and getting themselves into problems. So one of the things is that maybe more redistribution and giving people opportunities where they are would at least limit the people who are very desperate to move over borders.
Yes, I agree entirely. As I said, I think sometimes people misunderstand when we talk about international aid from European countries to the southern globe. It's not a handout. It shouldn't be used as a handout. It should be used to enable economic development. And I agree with you. I think in the long term, that really is the solution. Most people don't want to leave their homes and their families and their language and culture and everything else, but they are forced to through economic reasons. And therefore, if you can invest in infrastructure and employment, that will stem the tide in the long term.
Spain the Prime Minister has suggested that he wants to eliminate prostitution within this legislature, which means within the next 1 or 2 years. That sounds like an extremely tall order, and many have tried it before him. The main thing is that prostitution is legal in Spain at the moment, and there's still a tremendous amount of trafficking going on, and abuses and women getting murdered and abused. What will happen to these people once it becomes illegal? Because it's all very well saying we will make it illegal, but it won't go away, it will be there, right? What do you think as an expert?
Well, I think you only have to look at the example of America during the 30s of prohibition. All that did was enrich a lot of organized criminals. So I disagree. I think if you drive something underground, you just push it into the hands of people who will exploit that demand in a different way. So I disagree with that totally. I don't think it will solve the problem. I actually think it will make it worse.
Yes, that's my feeling as well, but you're the expert. One more question, and that's a personal one. There's so much talk about PTSD, and in your career, you've seen some horrific things. You've dealt with some horrific cases. Have you ever suffered from PTSD? What's your method to stay sane when you see things like that?
Maybe you should ask Lorna. Lorna's here, but she also had a difficult job, which is why we went to Spain for 2 years. I think seriously, the answer is perspective. That however horrific it is, you must remember that you're a professional. If you become emotionally involved, however much you may care, you're not doing anybody any good. Ultimately, you're a professional. So you have to create distance between yourself and the job that you're doing. That doesn't mean to say that you're inhuman, on the contrary. But there's two things. You have to create that distance, say, I'm doing a job, this is something I'm doing to the best of my ability, but I cannot get involved. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I'm pleased to say I don't do these things on my own. If you work in a team, I've worked in a multidisciplinary team, a multi-agency team of people across the board, and we support each other. And I think that's really, really important, that you work in a team and people, if you're feeling down or if you need just express your feelings, or if you need a second opinion, you know you've got a good team around you. And I've been privileged to work in a number of very highly skilled professional teams. So I think that helps. And I think the third one, just from a personal point of view, is I practice Tai Chi, and I would recommend it to anybody.
Thank you very much, because I think this is a really important, and I see two persons lined up, René and then Neil Corre.
There was the comment about Spain and prostitution, but I suppose not to offend Laran, but I think in Sweden, partly prostitution is prohibited. But as you said, people are people, and I suppose it's just pushed under the carpet, and so the real problem is not fixed.
Well, my question is related to Piotr's question, although the other way around, not the psychological effect on you, but the effect on victims. Do rescued people sometimes suffer from Stockholm syndrome?
Yes, that's a good question as well. Yes, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as Stockholm syndrome per se, but I think what you find is, because of this system of coercive control, people do not realize that they're victims. They think they have been befriended. This is particularly the case in these young women who were dreadfully sexually exploited by groups of men in England over a few years ago now, maybe, and it's still going on, unfortunately, but in particularly rife about 10 years ago. And they didn't realize they were victims. They described them as my boyfriend, my friend, whatever. So it's more that, if that's what the Stockholm syndrome is, then maybe that's the right term. But it's more that they would not realize they were victims, and therefore one of the support mechanisms that needs to come into place once people are rescued is psychological support, medical support, economic support, but psychological support is really important. That people will suffer from the trauma of this probably for the rest of their life. At a conference that I went to a few years ago from the National Working Group on exploitation, we had a couple of rescued people, some people who are survivors. They like to call themselves as survivors. And one young woman got up very bravely and described her life since she survived. And she's managed to rebuild her life. She has a family of her own. She's married. She's settled. And I don't think I've ever seen a group of hardened professionals brought to tears and stand up and all applaud when this young woman got up and told her story. But part of that story was the support mechanisms that came in place to help her with the trauma. But the fact that people don't recognize their victims till later on means that they need that psychological counseling.
very much. This is I think a very clear answer to questions. Have any more questions? We are getting to the end of our session now. Well, thanks, Geoff. This was an extraordinarily interesting presentation, I think. But then one more question, and then I'll have a couple of announcements, and we will close it here.
Yeah, of course, I agree too that trafficking and prostitution is a very difficult case. But also, I want to bring the attention to that. I mean, we also, for instance, in Denmark, we saw recently a case where basically truck drivers from Philippines and Asia was contracted in via subsidiaries in Poland, which was just set up as a post box. So they were basically working for Danish truck companies, but their contracts was in Poland, and it means their condition was extremely poor, and that I mean it was a very bad case. And even in the end, the union in Denmark managed to expose it and take it to the court. Then basically these guys didn't get any compensation; they were just basically sent home. And there, you can say there was nothing illegally in the end. It was just that some company are finding the loopholes between the different countries' regulation.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, well, I hope the new legislation going through will be a pan-Europe legislation.
I see here was a question from Andra, which has come on the chat, and as the chat is practically behind my head. I overlooked it. Thanks, Teresa, for pointing it out. Andra's question is, thank you so much for the press ration. I wonder what is the best route for taking a professional career in this field. I'm very passionate, but because I don't have work experience, I'm unable to start at work. Do you know any organizations that accept volunteers in London? Thank you.
In London? Or...
Yes, that's the message I received.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yes, I can probably reckon you can become a volunteer with an organisation, with my organisation, which is called Locate International. We have volunteers, but it's mainly involved in cold cases of missing people. But I can write that up on there, and you may wish to get involved with Locate International. If you also want to look at some further research and also donate some money, if you can, there's two organisations I would recommend: Anti-Slavery International and ECPAT International. ECPAT stands for Every Child Protected Against Trafficking. So the first one is adult organisation and the second is children, and they both do work internationally. So you can also contact them about ECPAT will also take volunteers as well. So that they are based in London. ECPAT UK. So there's ECPAT in each country. So there's ECPAT UK, for example, and there's ECPAT International. So you can try one of those or all those three very fine organisations.
Very good, thank you. And Andra, go ahead. Okay, so I think this will be the end of the session. Well, again, thanks very much, Geoff. One remark before we close down, actually two. First of all, Teresa suggested that you should ask for feedback from the participants. What did you take away from this session? And we would like to share it. When we publish this video on Facebook, we would like to share it with and also on our website, sort of see if we can carry on with the ideas which were stirred in this during this session, and see what else we can do with it. So your feedback will be very much appreciated. I've shown my email address right at the beginning of the chat. I'll show it again before we close down.
Oh, I've got your email address. That's okay. That's okay. I've got yours.
Yes. So all the participants, please, if you
sure.
want. And another one, Vladan is having a meeting on Friday of his migration group, which I'll be joining this Friday. And so if Vladan, are you with us still? I can't see you on the screen.
Yeah, sure, I'm listening. Yeah.
Yes, so if anybody wants to join Vladan's group, because certainly the subject is very germane, it's very sort of very close to your specialty, right?
I'll try and join you, Vladan, if I can. If you could send me the details,
Yeah.
I will. If I type my email address, I will try
Yeah,
and.
we will distribute all this information. I have received, with Vladan's permission, I will send you the meeting details because I've already received them, and we will circulate this information to all the people interested. So if there are no further questions or last minute remarks, well, thank you very much, Geoff. It was really interesting, and we just didn't see the time flying. Thank you very much, and we hope to have you again soon, because I think you still have a lot to teach us. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Geoff.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. That was a very informative evening.
Thank you.
Good night to all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.